students, welcome, Hoshamdeed and Hosh Galdanes. Today I am going to discuss an American poetess with you. Yes, we are going to discuss Emily Dickenson today. We are going to discuss the background of Emily Dickenson as well as the major themes or the poetic conscience of Emily Dickenson in our today's discussion. So let's start our discussion. Emily Dickenson was born on December 10th, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She attended a seminary, a female seminary in South Hadley. Throughout her life, she seldom left her home and she had very few visitors. That's why it is said that she had led a life of seclusion and isolation. The people with whom she did in contact, however, had an enormous impact on her poetry. Yes, critics consider that the people who had been remained in contact with Emily Dickenson or who were close to Emily Dickenson, they had a very strong impact on the themes and notions of Emily Dickinson's poetry. When we talk about the rise of poetic conscience in Emily Dickenson, then we cannot forget the important incident of her life that had played the role of a triggering thing. Rather, we can say that that very incident triggered the poetic conscience of Emily Dickenson. She was particularly stirred by the Reverend Charles Wordsworth, and she was particularly stirred by the Reverend Charles Wadsworth, whom she was met on a trip to Philadelphia. It is said that Emily fell in love with that person, or at least she got attached with that person. Well, he left for the West Coast shortly after a visit to her home in 1860, and some critics believe that his departure gave rise to the heartsick flow of verses from Dickenson in the years that followed. So it was a triggering incident of a heartbreak that triggered the heartbroken poetry, the heartbroken fallow in Emily Dickenson, and she started writing poetry after that. While it is certain that he was an important figure in her life, it isn't yet clear, or it can never be taken as like something that relationship was a romantic relationship. She called him my closest earthly friend. So from this very statement, from we cannot assume that it was necessarily a love relationship or something like that, but he was a very close friend of Emily Dickenson, and his departure caused a heartbreak for Emily Dickenson, and after that she started writing poetry. There could be other reasons, there could be other unfulfilled love desires, there could be the possibility of other love affairs, but on the other hand, on the contrary, Emily Dickenson belonged to a very orthodox Christian family, a very orthodox religious family. So there wasn't a question of so many affairs, but there can be a possibility, there could be a possibility of other unfulfilled loves. Well, the effects of which are depicted through her poems that put her into a complete seclusion, isolation. Dickinson's reason and intellect was flourished in the company of some intellectual friends as well as of some family members. Because her father was a very prestigious person, and they had somehow the visitors who were of a great prestige and of a great intellect. That's why in the company of those fellows, Emily Dickenson learned a lot. She was very close to her brother and her sister. Her brother Austin, who studied law, and her sister Lavinia. She was very close to Emily Dickinson, and she too spent her life in isolation. Emily Dickinson's poetry was highly or heavily influenced by the metaphysical poets of 17th century England. Perhaps the reason can be that she had an upbringing in a Puritan New England town, and she was the part of an orthodox, conservative, religious family. Well, the poetic notions of Emily Dickinson's the poetic notions of Emily Dickinson's go in contrast to all these things, to all these facts. Her poetic notions are extremely rebellious. Somehow we can find the feminist notions in her poetry as well. She wasn't a nun, as few people just are some critics. They consider that she had lived a life of isolation. That's why she could be considered a nun. No, she wasn't a nun, because the kind of themes we find in her poetry can never be the themes of the poetry of a nun. She was a very rebellious and a resisting soul, and she wasn't a nun. In fact, despite the fact that she lived a life of isolation and solitude, she wasn't a nun. Emily Dickinson's poetry was discovered after her death, and it wasn't in a proper form. Rather, they were hand stitched volumes of papers that had poems in them, but then later on those poems were rearranged and edited as their original version by Ralph W. Franklin. He reassembled the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Some critics since then said that that they have argued that there is a thematic unity in these small collections of poetry, rather than their order being simply chronological or convenient. Let's come to the major themes of Emily Dickinson's poetry. The first and foremost prevalent, rather pivotal theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is death. So, death is one of the foremost themes in Emily Dickinson's poetry. No two poems have exactly the same understanding of death, however. Means to say that in different poems, she has tried to represent the different approaches towards death. And she hasn't considered death as a terrible thing. Sometimes she considers, in her poems, she considers death as a very gentle phenomena. She considers death as a very peaceful phenomenon, as a very gentle phenomenon in her poems. Like particularly in her poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Die. Dickinson investigates the physical process of dying. So she has discovered a lot of approaches towards death in her poems. In another poem that is also academically celebrated, Because I Couldn't Stop for Death, she personifies death and presents the process of dying as simply the realization that there is another life. Yes, she represents the realization of an eternal life. She often takes death as a reward for life. Well, this is a very remarkable and very dynamic approach, and it is also a very rebellious approach, that she takes death as a reward for life. All of these varied pictures of death, however, do not truly contradict each other in Emily Dickinson's poetry. The second prevalent theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is uh, truth, the exploration of truth, or we can say the exploration of the nature of truth. Emily Dickinson, uh, when we analyze her poetry, we find that Dickinson is fascinated, rather, she's obsessed with the idea of truth or with the idea of finding truth. And in her poem, she uses her poem as a gadget to explore the phenomenon of truth. She knows that this is close to impossible. Like, to explore truth is impossible. Still, she tries to play with ideas that can help us to explore the truth. In her poem, To Fill a Gap, she teaches that that the answer of one question leads to another question. So the answers lead to further questions. Yet, Emily Dickinson also posits that a kind of truth can be found by finding the answers of different questions regarding the ontological and epistemological phenomena of human existence. Questions arises out of the answers of other questions, but still there is a way you can roughly reach to the truth of the universe and towards the truth of human existence. Another diverse angle of Emily Dickinson in terms of exploring the truth is that Dickinson clearly shows that truth is found more easily in negative or painful emotions. Rather, you can't estimate or you can't reach to the truth in a happy or in a playful moments. Rather, you can reach to the truth in pain. Rather, painful emotions actually lead to the truth, according to the reason of Emily Dickinson. For example, in her poem, I Like a Look of Agony, she shows how she can only trust a person who's dying, because that is the one thing that can't be faked. In easy words, we can say that although her own grief is more powerful than the others, but she considers that the very time period, the very thing is actually pleasant, is actually fascinating, because on that time nobody can fake one's emotions. So I Like a Look of Agony is something that represents that feelings can't be faked while a person is dying. Sorry, but we can say that when anyone is dying, the one cannot just fake one's emotions. So on that time, we can find the evidence of truth in one's condition, in one's emotions, and in one's gossips as well. On that time, we can find something honest from a person, according to Emily Dickinson's vision in the poem I Like a Look of Agony. Another important theme, or the prominent theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry, is fame and success. Dickinson wrote many poems dealing with the themes of fame and success, and those poems they elucidate the negative sides of these ostensibly positive things. So again, we can find a very diverse angle. Again, we can find the rebellious and dynamic approach of Emily Dickenson towards truth, that she doesn't consider fame and success as something good. She considers it something negative. In terms of the social perspective, maybe in I Am Nobody, Who Are You? It's a very beautiful poem. I am nobody, who are you? To gain fame, she says that to gain fame, one must advertise oneself, use one's own name and identity as marketing tools. So, this way, the approach is highlighted that becoming famous or getting fame is like you are advertising your own self, is like you are marketing your skills. So according to Emily Dickinson, fame and success, or the obsession for fame and success, these are the negative things, these are the negative traits. So getting popularity or success by advertising yourself isn't a good thing, according to Dickinson's view. According to Dickinson, this type of fame is made meaningless by the fact that its audience is an unthinking bog. It's a very dynamic thing. Success, however, is considered dangerous, according to Emily Dickinson. It is dangerous for it takes away the speaker's ability to appreciate that success. So it's a very remarkable view of Emily Dickinson towards success and fame. Emily Dickinson focuses on the negativities of fame and success, and it seems from her poems that Emily isn't interested in getting popularity or in getting fame. She doesn't consider it anything that can be tempting for a person. So success and fame were not Emily's temptations. She was happier, unpublished and unknown. And she celebrated herself being unknown, being an unknown person. She felt comfortable in being unpublished and in being unknown. Perhaps the reason behind that there are so many dangers behind getting popularity and fame. Perhaps that's the reason Emily isn't fascinated by the idea of fame and success. But still, somehow, she is fascinated by the idea, but she doesn't encourage this idea of fame and popularity, particularly for her own self. The fourth major theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is grief. Grief is virtually omnipresent in Emily Dickinson's poetry. Other characters are few and far between in these poems, but grief is particularly Dickinson's primary companion. In fact, according to Emily Dickinson, grief is the only thing that keeps her in contact with the other persons and that enables her to feel for the other persons, for the other people, to feel for the emotions of other people. That's why grief is a prominent theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry, and not only the theme, but also it sounds like a very close companion of Emily Dickinson if we analyze the poetry of Emily Dickinson in depth. Emily Dickinson, in her poetry, tries to highlight the positive sides of grief. She thinks that it is grief that actually gives her strength and power to speak, to write, and to think. Grief, however, emboldens her makes her able to face anything, and gives her the strength, and it gives her strength and perceptiveness to write the poetry that she does. So, grief enables her to write what she feels, what she thinks, and what she believes in. The fifth important theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is faith. So, faith is another prominent theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Dickinson's poetry is highly interested in faith, in God, and also in religion. According to her, God is essential to her, yet she is unwilling to just accept the traditional dogma, and so she explores or she tries to explore the other possibilities for faith in her poetry. Just like while she follows stanzas from, she breaks conventions of rhyme and punctuations. Yes, the technically radical step of Emily Dickinson is that she breaks the conventions of rhyme and punctuation in her poetry. She has her own style of writing. She has her own style of rhyming, and she has her own way to use punctuation in her poetry. This is technically a radical thing or a radical aspect of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Despite the faith in God, in religion, and in the value of truth, her poems and her poetry never ever claim to any understanding of the divine. This is a very important thing in terms of the theme of faith in her poetry. She is certain of God's inscrutability. And in her poetry, she tries to establish a relationship with Him that can never be fully investigated and that can never be fully explored. She has her own way to develop a relationship with God. In many of her poems, in which there is another figure besides the speaker, it is often unclear. Many critics consider that this figure is the figure of God. But it isn't clear that either this figure is the figure of God or is the figure of a lover. But when we consider the nature of Emily Dickinson's life, or the way she had led a life of seclusion and isolation, in terms of that, we can consider that very figure can be taken as the figure of God. And these poems can often be read either way. This elucidates the profound closeness of Emily Dickinson with God, or at least this shows that she tries to search for God in her poems, in her poetry. The sixth, or I think the seventh important theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is the quest for freedom. In her poetry, we find her exploring freedom. We find her urging for freedom from the traditional, dogmatic, and conventional setups of society. In Dickinson's poems is inexpensive and is greatly a liberating force. Rather, it is used as a force in her poems. In her poem, They Shut Me Up in Prose, she speaks against the roles that are imposed on women and that are meant to keep her in the four walls of the house, and the things that just delimit the freedom of a female, of an individual, they are highlighted and explored in this poem, They Shut Me Up, in prose. These limitations, however, only inspire her further and fuel her to write her poetry, feverishly. This cannot limit. No matter how they try, her poetry is limitless, as she shows us in another poem, I dwell in possibility. I dwell in possibility. It is again a poem that, in that very poem, we find Emily Dickenson celebrating her individuality and her zest for writing poetry. Because in this poem, the setting is like it's a house with no roof but the sky. So her imaginations and her aspirations are high, just like a sky, and they're broad, just like the sky. So the traditional dogmatic approaches can never delimit her, can never confine her, can never confine her skills. So the whole skills are used to, the whole lot of those skills are used to write poetry. And that's why Emily Dickinson's poetry is extremely radical, and it is highly celebrated in the history of American literature. The eighth important theme of Emily Dickinson's poetry is the intensity of emotions and the density of feelings. Yes, in Emily Dickinson's poetry, we find the intense emotions and we find the dense feelings, although somehow we find some somber effects in her poetry. Dickinson's poetry exhibits a profound intensity of emotions, and almost all of her poems focus on this as a subject matter. This very thing, the intensity of emotions, is throughout evident in her poems, and it is the pivotal subject matter of her poetry. In her poem, I like A Look of Agony, she shows that only the most intense emotions can be trusted, can be exhibited for others with whole honesty. And thus, only the most intense emotions belong to poetry. So this is the subject matter of this poem. And again, this is solely based on the value of intense emotions. She considers the intensity of emotions as a sign of honesty and as a sign of loyalty and sincerity. So I think it's enough for today. We have discussed the background of Emily Dickinson as a poetess, and then we have just tried to briefly discuss or highlight the themes of her poetry, the major themes of her poetry, which are 7 to 8. I'm going to summarize them. The major elements or themes of her poetry include the themes of death, the themes of exploring truth or exploring the nature of the truth, the themes of fame and success, or better to say, Dickinson's pondering on the elements of fame and success. Grief is another theme. Then comes faith and freedom, and intensity of emotions and density of feelings are the important and major prevalent themes of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Thank you so much for today. Allah Hafiz.